Welcome to Modern Love Diaries, a place for stories about love, connection, and everything in between. James woke up at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of the refrigerator humming and realized, with the kind of clarity that only comes in the middle of the night, that he couldn't remember the last time he and Sophie had touched each other on purpose. Not sexually, though that too, but at all. A hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing the coffee pot, the small, thoughtless gestures that used to punctuate their days like commas in a long, comfortable sentence. He lay in the darkness of their bedroom in their Minneapolis apartment, listening to Sophie's steady breathing beside him. They still slept in the same bed. They still said, "I love you," before leaving for work. They still split the grocery bill and took turns with the recycling and texted each other throughout the day about mundane things, dinner plans, whether they needed paper towels, a funny thing someone said in a meeting. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, James felt like he was living with a very considerate stranger. He got up carefully, trying not to disturb her, and padded into the kitchen. Their apartment was small, but well-designed. He'd made sure of that when they moved in 6 years ago, fresh off his promotion to senior architect at the firm. The exposed brick, the open shelving, the carefully selected light fixtures. He'd been so proud of this space. They both had been. Now it just felt like a museum of who they used to be. James poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. March in Minneapolis meant dirty snow piled against curbs and that particular kind of cold that made you question every life choice that had led you to the upper Midwest. But he and Sophie had always loved it here, or they had, once. "Can't sleep?" He turned. Sophie stood in the doorway wearing one of his old college t-shirts and flannel pajama pants. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and without makeup, she looked both younger and more tired than her 37 years. "Sorry, did I wake you?" "No." She moved into the kitchen, maintaining the careful distance they'd perfected over the past year, maybe longer. "James," Sophie said quietly, "we need to talk." His stomach dropped, though he'd been expecting this, dreading it, wanting it, all at the same time. "Yeah, I know."
They'd met at 26, both bright-eyed and ambitious in the way you can only be in your mid-20s when you still believe hard work and good intentions will be enough. James had just started at Fletcher & Associates, working 100-hour weeks and living on coffee and takeout. Sophie was finishing her master's in public health, volunteering at a free clinic while juggling 2 part-time jobs. They met at a friend's birthday party in a crowded bar in Uptown, and James had been drawn to her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, which she was, but because she had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She'd asked him about his work, and he'd found himself telling her about a community center project he was working on, how he wanted to design spaces that actually served people's lives instead of just looking impressive in architectural magazines. "That's what buildings should be," she'd said, her eyes bright. "Places that hold people's real stories, not just their Instagram posts." He'd fallen in love with her that night, though it took him 3 more dates to admit it. The first 2 years were golden. They moved in together after 6 months, too fast by conventional wisdom, but it felt right. They cooked elaborate meals on Sunday afternoons, stayed up late talking about their dreams, made love on the couch while the TV played unwatched in the background. They traveled to Seattle and New Orleans and Montreal, collecting memories and inside jokes and a shared vision of their future. Years 3 through 5 were good too, if less golden. James made senior architect. Sophie got her dream job at the state health department. They talked about marriage, but never quite got around to it. It seemed like a formality when they were already building a life together. They bought good furniture. They adopted a cat named Miso, who died 2 years later, and they cried together and promised to wait before getting another one. Years 6 through 8 were fine. Busy, but fine. James took on bigger projects with longer hours. Sophie's job became increasingly stressful as funding cuts hit the department. They saw each other less, but that was normal, right? That was just what happened when you were in your 30s and building careers. They still had good weekends. They still laughed together. They were fine. Years 9 through 11, James wasn't sure what happened. Nothing dramatic, no betrayals or blow-ups or obvious turning points, just a slow, almost imperceptible drift, like continental plates moving apart 1 millimeter at a time. They stopped cooking together. They stopped making plans more than a day in advance. Sex became something they did occasionally, efficiently, like checking an item off a list. They were polite, they were considerate, they were living parallel lives in the same small apartment. And now, year 12. James was 38, Sophie was 37. They'd spent their entire 30s together, and somewhere along the way they'd stopped being in love and started being, what? Roommates? Business partners? The caretakers of a shared life neither of them knew how to leave?
They sat at the kitchen table, another careful distance maintained. It was 2:43 a.m., and the apartment was so quiet James could hear the clock ticking in the living room. "I don't know when it happened," Sophie said finally. Her voice was soft but steady. "I've been trying to figure it out. Was it 3 years ago? 5? But I can't pinpoint it. Can you?" James shook his head. "No, it just faded, like a photograph left in the sun." "Do you remember the last good year?" He thought about it. "Maybe year 5, when we went to New Orleans for your birthday and spent the whole weekend eating beignets and walking through the French Quarter? That was good." 7 years ago, Sophie said quietly. The number hung between them, heavy and damning. "We should have done something then. When we first noticed it starting to fade, we should have fought for it. Would it have made a difference?" "I don't know." He ran his hair through his hair, a nervous gesture he'd had since college. "Maybe we were just too tired. Maybe we let work become everything because it was easier than facing this." Sophia wrapped her hands around her mug, though she hadn't made tea. It was just something to hold. "I keep thinking about what we used to talk about. Do you remember? We'd stay up until 3 in the morning planning our whole lives, where we'd travel, what kind of house we'd buy, whether we wanted kids, what we'd be like in our 50s. When did we stop doing that? When we stopped being curious about each other, I think. When we started assuming we knew everything. When we stopped asking questions. I can tell you your coffee order and your shoe size and what kind of mood you'll be in based on how you close the front door," Sophie said. "But I can't tell you what you're afraid of anymore. I can't tell you what keeps you up at night besides insomnia. I can't tell you what you want. Do you know what you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to feel something again. Not just comfortable, not just fine. I want to wake up and feel excited about my day. I want to have conversations that surprise me. I want—" She paused. "I want to stop feeling like I'm 25, playing house in a grown-up's life." James felt something crack open in his chest. "I thought it was just me." "No." Sophie's eyes were wet now, but her voice stayed steady. "It's not just you. I think we're both lonely, James. We're lonely together, which is maybe the worst kind of lonely there is." They sat in silence. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car drove past, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. "What do we do?" James asked finally. Sophie looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months. "I think you know." The honest answer was that James had known for at least a year, maybe 2. But knowing and acknowledging were different things, and acknowledging and acting were different still. It was easier to keep going, to maintain the routine, to tell himself that this was just what long-term relationships looked like, that passion faded, that comfort was enough, that love could be quiet and still and numb. But it couldn't, could it? That wasn't love. That was just two people too afraid to be alone. I don't want to hate you, Sophie said. If we keep going like this, eventually we will. We'll resent each other for all the years we wasted, for all the things we didn't do because we were too comfortable to leave. I could never hate you. Not now, but give it another 5 years of this? Another 10? She shook her head. I don't want to find out. James felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. I loved you so much. I still love you, just not in the way you deserve. I know. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand, the first intentional touch in he didn't know how long. Her hand was warm and familiar and felt like saying goodbye. I love you too. Maybe that's why we need to do this, because we love each other enough to let go. They decided to wait until morning to make any concrete plans. It seemed wrong to dismantle 12 years of life at 3 in the morning. Instead, they stayed at the kitchen table and did something they hadn't done in years. They talked. Really talked. Sophie told him about a project at work she was excited about, a new public health initiative that might actually make a difference. James told her about a pro bono community center he'd been designing in his spare time, something he'd been too embarrassed to mention because it felt self-indulgent when he should be focused on billable hours. They talked about their families, Sophie's mom's upcoming retirement, James's brother's new baby, the complicated dynamics they'd both been navigating, mostly alone, because they'd stopped sharing these things somewhere along the way. They even laughed. Sophie told him about a disastrous blind date her coworker had tried to set up for her sister, and James found himself genuinely amused in a way he hadn't been in months. I forgot how funny you are, he said. I forgot that you think I'm funny. As the night slipped into early morning, James felt something unexpected, relief. Not happiness, the grief was too real for that, but relief that they were finally being honest, that they were finally seeing each other again instead of just moving around each other like furniture. By the time the sky started to lighten, they'd made some basic decisions. James would move out. Sophie had been in the apartment first, and it felt right that she should stay. They'd split things fairly and without lawyers if they could help it. They'd try to stay friends, though they both knew that was easier said than done. I keep thinking about all the things we said we'd do, Sophie said as Dawn painted the kitchen walls soft gray. That trip to Japan, learning to make pasta from scratch, getting a dog, maybe even having kids someday. We can still do those things, just not together. I know, it's just strange to think about. 12 years of a future that won't happen. James squeezed her hand, which he'd been holding on and off for the past few hours. We'll have different futures, maybe better ones. Maybe. Sophie smiled, sad but genuine. I hope so. I really hope so. The actual logistics of untangling took 3 months. James found a 1-bedroom in northeast Minneapolis, closer to his office and to the river he liked to run along. Sophie kept the apartment and most of the furniture. James wanted a fresh start, something that didn't remind him of what they'd been. They divided their possessions with surprising ease. After 12 years, they knew each other well enough to be fair. Sophie took the good coffee maker. James took the Le Creuset pot. She kept the photo albums. He kept the art prints from their trip to Montreal. They laughed awkwardly over who would get the mismatched wine glasses they'd collected from various apartments and thrift stores. You take them, James said. You're the one who actually has people over. That's because you're the introvert who needs 3 weeks' notice for social interaction. past tense, he said gently. I was the introvert. You don't know who I'll be now. That stopped her. You're right. I don't. It was the kind of moment that punctuated those 3 months, small recognitions that they were already becoming strangers, that the intimate knowledge they'd built was already starting to erode. It hurt, but it was necessary, like physical therapy after an injury, painful but healing. They told their friends over dinner at the Thai place they'd been going to for years. There were tears and questions and uncomfortable silences, but also understanding. Most of their friends were in their mid to late 30s too, and several admitted they'd wondered if James and Sophie were really happy or just comfortable. You guys always seemed fine, their friend Rachel said carefully, but fine isn't the same as good, is it? No, it's really not. James's parents took it harder than expected. They'd loved Sophie, had considered her a daughter for over a decade, but when James explained, really explained, in a way he rarely did with his parents, his mother surprised him. I'm sad, but I'm not disappointed in you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit something isn't working, even after 12 years. Maybe especially after 12 years. The hardest part was the in-between time, still living together while James waited for his new lease to start. They were unfailingly polite, gave each other space, didn't fall into old patterns. But there were moments. A hand reaching for the light switch at the same time, the smell of Sophie's shampoo in the bathroom, the way James organized the dishwasher in that specific way that used to drive her crazy and now just made her sad. One night, 2 weeks before James's move-out date, Sophie knocked on the guest bedroom door where he'd been sleeping. Can I come in? Of course. She sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment, James thought maybe she'd changed her mind, maybe she wanted to try again. But then she said, I just wanted to tell you that I don't regret it. Any of it. Even knowing how it ends. Yeah? Yeah. You were my entire 20s and most of my 30s. You made me laugh and held me when I cried and taught me how to be in a relationship with another person. Even if we're not right for each other anymore, we were right for a long time. That counts. James felt his throat tighten. It counts. I hope you find someone who makes you excited again, someone who asks you questions and challenges you and doesn't just assume they know everything about you. I hope you find that too. Sophie smiled. Maybe we'll both find ourselves first. I think that's what we really lost. Not each other, but ourselves. We got so comfortable being James and Sophie that we forgot how to just be James and just be Sophie. She left the room quietly, and James lay in the darkness thinking about who he'd been at 26 and who he'd become at 38. Somewhere in those 12 years, he'd stopped designing buildings he cared about and started chasing promotions. He'd stopped calling his friends and stopped running along the river and stopped asking himself what he actually wanted from his life. He'd let the relationship be an excuse, let it be a container that held him, but also limited him. And Sophie had done the same. Maybe this ending was also a beginning. Moving day was a Saturday in late May, warm and bright in the way that Minnesota springs could be after a long winter. James's friends helped load boxes into a rented truck, while Sophie stayed at her sister's place. They'd agreed it would be easier that way. He did one last walkthrough of the empty apartment. The space looked bigger without their furniture, cleaner without their accumulated life. He stood in the kitchen and remembered that night at 2 a.m., the conversation that had changed everything. He felt grateful for it now, grateful they'd had the courage to be honest. On the kitchen counter, Sophie had left an envelope with his name on it. Inside was a card with a photograph tucked inside. The two of them in New Orleans 7 years ago, young and happy and still curious about each other. On the back of the photo, Sophie had written, "The last good year," but not the last good year we'll have, just separately. Thank you for 12 years. Thank you for letting me go. Love, S. James stood in the empty kitchen and cried. Not for what they'd lost exactly, but for what they'd had. For the fact that love could be real and true and still end. That you could care about someone deeply and still need to leave. That courage sometimes looked like saying goodbye. He tucked the photo in his pocket, locked the door for the last time, and drove to his new apartment. 3 months later, James sat on his small balcony in northeast Minneapolis, drinking morning coffee and watching the city wake up. His new place was sparse, but deliberately so. He'd bought only what he needed, nothing more. The emptiness felt good, spacious, full of possibility. He'd thrown himself into the pro bono community center project, staying late at the office not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd reconnected with old friends he'd let drift away. He'd started running along the river again, early mornings when the air was cool and the water was still. He was learning how to be just James again. It was harder than he expected, but better too. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. "Miso's anniversary. Thinking about you." He smiled. They'd been keeping in touch, carefully, infrequently, but genuinely. It turned out you could care about someone and not be in their life every day. It turned out love could change shape without disappearing entirely. He texted back, "Thinking about you too. Hope you're well." 3 dots appeared, then, "I am, really. Are you?" James looked out at the morning, at the river in the distance, at the life he was slowly building from scratch at 38. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 26. It wasn't the life he'd been living at 36. It was something else, something uncertain and occasionally lonely, but also honest, alive, his. He typed, "Yeah, I am." And for the first time in years, it wasn't just what you said to be polite. It was the truth. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, I'd love it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to Modern Love Diaries for more stories about love, connection, and the courage it takes to be honest with ourselves. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop your city and the time you're listening from in the comments below. Whether it's 2 a.m. in Chicago or 11 p.m. in Portland, I'm so glad you're here. Until next time, take care of yourselves.